Welcome back to these hearings, the CEDAW hearings, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, on the 25th of May 2023 at the University of New South Wales. And we'd like now to welcome witness Barbary Clarke. Barbary, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Barbary Clarke. I'm a 73-year-old pensioner with the late effects of polio, but also a background in advocacy and academia, which have helped to inform my system in the disability sphere. And some of the primary people who don't know anything about polio are just about every healthcare provider you ever come across, both medical and allied, because it was removed from the curriculum in about the 50s or 60s because they thought they'd got it under control with the vaccinations. I was given polio by a vaccination. I was told by my mother. Polio is like motor neuron disease. It attacks the motor neurons that run between your muscles and your brain. And if more than 50% of your motor neurons in one area are knocked out, then you're paralysed. Luckily, it didn't attack my lungs. So unlike Jean Middleton, who spent her time in a metal tank, horizontal metal tank the size of a hot water system for 61 years, I've been able to get about in a certain way, but it attacked my left arm and my right leg. So it was asymmetrical, and I've got a kink in my spine because of that, which makes my body go out numerous times a week, and it's extremely painful. And I see my beloved osteopath once a week at a great cost to get my musculoskeletal frame back in place. But at the moment, one of my biggest problems is that the muscles in my foot, or the ligaments or whatever they are in my foot, aren't strong enough to keep my toes all in line. And so every step I take, it feels as if I am treading on a knife diagonally embedded in my foot, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So there's quite a bit of pain, but a couple of Panadols a day seem to bring it to manageable portions. I'm getting weaker and weaker. I need a leg brace. Like I said, I'm on the pension. The leg brace, including the original consultation, is almost $5,400, which if we take the first half of my pension is taken up by my ordinary osteo and lymphatic drainage and psychology, and if we add in the leg brace, that's going to take up 22 weeks of my pension. So I have to figure out some way of eating and paying my bills in the meantime. This is a pretty common problem with polio survivors. Some of them have worked at high-powered levels. Margaret Cooper worked at a pretty high-powered paid level, but most of us either don't work or have fairly low-paid jobs, which makes, if you're not on the NDIS, it makes paying for equipment very difficult. I'll get into the advocacy side of things now. Some years ago, when they were bringing in the NDIS, Tony Abbott said, I'm not going to pass this unless you exclude people over 65 from the NDIS. I think he was afraid that lots of people were going to have strokes and, you know, be a drain on the NDIS for a long time. So, and it's a very useful thing to be on, because, you know, some people's equipment, like car modifications or full body splints, cost, you know, 20s or 30s of thousands of dollars, and they simply wouldn't be able to afford it themselves. So it is a great boon to be in the NDIS, and it is somewhat less of a boon to be a part of my aged care, because my aged care does cover an exponentially smaller amount of your needs. They can pay for a small amount of equipment, or they can pay for you to have somebody to take you shopping or do some housework, as long as they don't have to reach up or bend down, which seems a bit odd to me, because housework seems to be all about reaching up and bending down to me. Anyway, I decided I wasn't going to avail myself of my aged care, even though I was entitled to the bottom level package. So my aim is to get onto the NDIS, and about 800 or so of us people over 65 are taking the government. Well, we're instituting a class action to try to rectify the situation, and it would be really good if that discriminatory clause were taken out of the. It seems so ironic to me that a discriminatory clause was inserted into an anti-discrimination piece of legislation, i.e. the Age Discrimination Act. Anyway, that's how it is. Yeah. So sometimes people, after the initial attack has knocked out, you know, some motor neurons, and you might have had some paralysis, sometimes your motor neurons, some of your motor neurons grow back, but they're not as long-lived or as strong as the original ones. And about 30 or 40 years after your original problem, the paralysis seems to creep back. But of course, doctors and other health-related people don't seem to understand that you can have two cracks at the cherry. They're more used to progressive slope of disability or illness or whatever. One of the main jobs of polio survivors is to educate healthcare providers. And this can be rather exhausting at times, when you get them looking at you as if you're a lunatic who doesn't know what the hell you're talking about. So some of them are very good. So I find it a bit ironic that the state caused my illness, but the state is refusing to fund my treatment at the moment, until we get our class action. Another colleague of mine is taking the government to the United Nations. In order to take an issue to the United Nations, you have to exhaust all domestic remedies, like you have to have taken it to the highest court here and not got a satisfactory answer. Now he's a barrister, so he can afford to do that, but I suppose 99.5% of the polio survivors that I know would not be in that financial position. So you could say that they might be denied access to justice. Polio Australia is doing a good job with very little money on spreading the word about polio, because it's not only healthcare providers who don't know about polio, it's people who've had polio, with paralysis. But there are a great number of people who have had polio, but they don't know that they've had polio because not 50% of their motor neurons were knocked out. So it presented more like a cold or flu, and it was there and it was gone. But then some of them do start to experience the sequelae in their later years, and they are totally unaware that this is as a result of polio. So we need some more education there. The government has been threatening to withdraw the funding of Polio Australia for their outreach. Their allied health people go out to regional and rural country towns and educate the doctors, the allied health care providers, and the populace about polio. But that funding is under threat, so they've had to. They've been given the opportunity, which it's quite good of this government to give them the opportunity to present a submission about why they should retain their funding. I suspect that the previous government might not have given them that opportunity. That relates to Article 14 of CEDAW with rural women. In my view, one of the greatest dangers to people with disability at the moment is the fact that Jason Ryman and Scott Britton, who were the architects of the Robodebt scheme, have now moved on to head up the National Disability Insurance Agency, which administers the NDIS. And they have had job ads in the paper for a person with the skills, the behavioural skills that they employed in scaring people who were on income support, on job seeker, to comply with the Robodebt scheme. If they're going to do the same thing that they did with Robodebt, and there's also the possibility that, like I said, polio survivors are often very poor, so a lot of them might well have been on job seeker, and now they're going to be put through the same ringer with the NDIA if Ryman and Britton remain there. So that's a bit of a problem in my view, and the NDIA is an agency of the federal government, and I think there's something in CEDAW which says that the government and its agencies must not discriminate against people. When COVID started, a document circulated amongst medical professionals, which had to fall off the back of a truck into the hands of one of the committee of the post-polio Victoria, of which I am a member. And we found out that the government was planning to triage older people and people with disabilities out of hospitals if there was no room in ICU beds, which to me, the preamble of CEDAW says that discrimination is applied equally, or lack of discrimination is applied equally to people, but apparently not to older people and disabled people who need a hospital bed. Accessibility is another issue which affects a lot of people with disability, and including people with polio. And I've done quite a lot of work in that regard. For 20 years, there has been activism to try to get accessibility mandated in the National Construction Code, which governs all building in Australia. But the Master Builders Association and Housing Industry Association have a very lucrative job in retrofitting accessibility features into houses. So they fought it for 20 years. But last year, the government finally gave in and said that they would mandate a level of accessibility in every house or flat or dwelling that is built from when the next version this year of the National Construction Code comes out. Now, the silver level of accessibility, as it's going to be to begin with, says you must have a stepless entry to your dwelling. Okay, maybe you have a stepless entry going from the car park to the house, but it says nothing about a stepless way of getting from the house into the garden. You have to have hallways of a certain width. It says you have to have fire doors. I think it says fire doors for your dwelling. Now, a friend of mine had a fire door on her small flat, which was purposely designed for people aging in place. The fire door was heavy metal, and as a semi-able-bodied person, it was impossible, almost impossible for me to open it. So if you can't open the front door to your flat, no matter how many accessibility features there are on the other side, it's as if they don't exist. There were things like a requirement for a stepless entry to the shower. She had a stepless entry to her shower, and every time she turned the shower on, the entire floor of her bathroom flooded. And there were no railings at all in the bathroom. So although a certain level of accessibility will be mandated, a great deal of work will still remain to be done in this sphere. And I'm a member of the Australian National Universal Housing Design Committee, which has a mix of health professionals and architects and planners and ratbags like me on it, which is quite a good mixture, because we talk well to whoever we're talking to, even though the Australian Building and Construction Board seem to have their fingers in their ears. They said that there was no evidence whatsoever that there was any need for accessibility to be built to building. As it was, there was quite a lot of qualitative evidence of people's lived experience, but the ABCB did not regard that as reputable evidence. So I went and got some case studies, and I also quoted a PhD of a friend of mine who had studied the difference between ageing and ageing with disability, but even in their final report, they did not quote that PhD. So the accessibility issue has to do with Article 7 on, public life, participation in public life.
women live longer than men do, and do the women with a disability likewise live longer than men? I'm just thinking that with this idea that, you know, you mentioned the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott saying that the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, shouldn't include those over 65. This would have impacted more on women, I expect, and also the notion of triaging those with disability and sending them off and out during the COVID, that also would have impacted more on women. Would that be correct?
I don't have any statistics or information to prove so, but one would assume that they're just part of the ordinary population, and we know that in the ordinary population, women do live longer than men.
I was thinking too about your colleague's PhD on the ageing with disability and ageing. And it would seem to me that, as you said, it should be a key reference in any of this work. So if you'd include the reference to it, the name of the author and the name of the PhD, that would be really, really helpful. It's something that should be out there in the publishing world.
Yes, I have included it in the list of references at the end of my submission.
Yeah, sorry, yes, you've got a good long list.
Nikki Heath, the name 1888.
Right, thank you. Well, now over to my colleague, to our panel. Any questions for Barbary?
I haven't got any particular questions, but I have to say I found your submission extremely enlightening and interesting.
Thank you. A lot of people don't know anything about polio, and it took me a long time to learn this stuff. I've only learned this stuff in the last 5 or so years myself. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Barbary, it's Mary. In relation to the NDIS, I know because my sister has a condition, even accessing the NDIS, and hopefully if they can amend that and change that and people over 65 can access that. I do note that when purchasing things like you said, things that you need for your disability, they're very expensive. So then I think another conversation will arise from that is the affordability, because you get a package with an NDIS if you're a client, and then usually have a case manager and they organise what you need and whatnot, whether that's therapy or work counselling, whatever it is for your condition. I find that a lot of the products that are being sold are expensive. So like my sister needs a stride, they call it a cool strider, and it's basically a pram, and she's only 16, so she's not very big and she's not an adult, but she's bigger than a normal child. So the prams are designed to hold that certain weight limit, and a pram that's a pram is about $5,000, which is crazy. Mm-hmm. So you find companies are making a lot of money from selling things that are actually required and needed by people with disabilities. So that's going to be another thing. And you probably find that as well, accessing things that you do need and you're paying, like you said, $5,000. Like, it's a lot of money. And there's it's like no one's really held accountable for products that are being sold, and where's the fairness in purchasing?
Yes, I haven't had experience of it myself, but I have heard numerous stories of people buying equipment, and they say, I want to buy this equipment, and they might be told it costs $100 or something. But then when the seller finds out that they're getting it through the NDIS, suddenly the price seems to escalate quite considerably.
Yes,
yeah,
that's true.
Case managers is not cheap either.
No.
And I had decided that if I was able to do it, if I got onto the NDIS, I would try to manage it myself.
Yeah.
They're not too keen on that, but I have mental facilities to do that.
Yeah, and that's understandable also with the self-managing element of that, they make it quite difficult, because obviously when you get reimbursed and you're claiming things as well, if they don't approve of that purchase, say it's a large purchase, you might need to spend $5,000 or $10,000, whatever's in your budget, and they think, oh, maybe this is malicious, and then they'll make you go in or make you provide those receipts. You just think that'd be an easier way to do these things, and especially with people with disabilities, they make it more so possible for someone with disabilities and the families that, you know, that have a child with a disability. So.
And you develop long-term relationships with your providers, your healthcare providers, for argument's sake. And then when you say, if you're self-managing the NDIS and you say, I want to have the provider that I've used for 25 years, they said, well, no, you've got to have a provider who's registered with us.
Yeah.
And I checked with my osteopath and she said it was quite expensive and involved a process to become registered with the NDIS. So if you've got 5 or 15 providers, that's, you know, quite a lot of paperwork and expense for them.
Exactly.
Yes, it's definitely not easy, but you know, I guess they've got to keep an eye on the expenses. Well, you know, one way of keeping an eye on the expenses would be, was stopping the independent assessors, which they were planning to implement, whereby if you were a current service provider for the NDIS, you could not apply to assess people for being on the NDIS because that would be seen as a conflict of interest. So the company would get one of its subsidiaries, which had a different name and possibly a different registration address, to tender for that job.
Did you have something, Helen?
Just quickly, Barbary, I'm just wondering how this is specifically, or the ways in which it is specifically an issue that forms discrimination against women.
Well, you know,
that it falls, the burdens fall unequally on women. And Jocelynne was mentioning about, you know, that you're more likely to be older, which then somebody might say, well, that's discrimination the other way. I don't say that, but I know that people do. But are there other areas like where things or services that women might need are more difficult to access or more difficult to make a case for? And the one thing that I have a big problem with in the NDIS is the funding of sexual assistance.
Yes.
And I kind of think this is something that's being pushed, obviously, not so much by women, although the prominent case that involved that was brought by a woman. But nevertheless, it does seem to me a particularly masculine kind of request. But I mean, I'm not saying that women don't have sexual needs, but it's the idea that the needs should be met by, you know, prostituting a woman who is likely also very likely, as we know, to suffer from PTSD from being in the prostitution system. You know, so you sort of shift the disability in some sense. So that's the one I can think of. But are there other issues where you think there is kind of substantial inequality that kind of crosses the disability and that? I haven't phrased it very well, but I think you know.
I thought about this issue when I read the preamble and the first article or so of CEDAW, because it was talking about the equality of women with men. It was always a comparator of men instead of comparing women with disabilities against women without disabilities. So that set up a little bit of a a contradiction in my mind. But okay, now think of the gender pay gap. So women have less payment over a lifetime, and therefore they have less money to pay for their aids. I could suggest a double orientation pay gap to you. When I was volunteering with the Victorian Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, I did a submission to the Australian Human Rights Commission on there were 114 Victorian laws which discriminated against gays and lesbians financially, everything from inheritance to superannuation to building up your pharmaceutical benefits, things high enough to get the discount. Not able at that stage, you are not able to join health insurance schemes as a family because marriage hadn't come in yet. So that was 114 Victorian laws, and there were 95 federal laws which financially discriminated against gays and lesbians. Now, they were changed back in 2001 and 2009, but you have the financial disadvantage of those earlier years, and more so for older women, just adding up and up and up and up and up and up, you know, exponentially accumulating, because if you don't make $1 back when you're 20 years old, that's quite a few dollars you don't have when you're 90.
It's like the superannuation gap, isn't it? That's a really good thing, yeah, that accumulation.
We have that too.
Because the concentration in the past has been on the wage gap or the pay gap, but that leads, as you say, exponentially to an even greater gap in terms of superannuation and pensions. And that's going to redound against women, as you've really said, Barbary, as a double whammy, because you're older, you've got your disability, and you've got less income and less resource.
And that's compounded by the fact that when women take maternity leave, they don't get their superannuation paid. They're complementary payments where you pay in when you're employed and your employer pays. Well, anything you pay, how am I going to put this? You can't pay in,
right?
Because you don't get that. And some employers are not paying for their superannuation anyway. There's quite a few. I mean, they've at least acknowledged it. They just haven't been able to do anything about it, other than legislation which they can't implement always. The point that I'm making is there's a child-bearing gap in a woman's life if she's on continuous employment, where she doesn't get that accumulation you're referring to.
Yeah, and even within the LGB community, there is a difference, because 2 gay guys, two male wages. You know, you can say one male wage plus one male wage equals 2 male wages. 2 lesbians, 0.8 of a male wage plus 0.8 of a male wage equals 1.6
time out
male wage when they're added together.
I think there is there's paid maternity leave now, though, isn't there? There's provision for paid maternity leave, and therefore that
to a certain extent. I mean, you've got to be employed by a period of time. You can't necessarily
No, yeah, that's right.
for
automatically
treatment
qualified.
to make sure you're inside that gap time.
Mm-hmm.
Many women miss out, although they're employed, they even often lose their jobs because of it.
Well, that's one of the easiest, it should be, discrimination cases to run.
No, I'm talking about the don't make the 12-month period before they discover. It might be 11.
Yeah. Could I just come back, Barbary, to the point that you were making about keeping the cost down, because this fits in with your point about the cost, and Mary Kerr's too, the cost of equipment. Because when they talk about keeping down the cost, or when that is talked about, it's generally talked about in terms of cutting the benefit or cutting the people on that are qualified with a disability. It's not directed towards the companies and what they're actually charging for the equipment. So that's a conversation, I hate the word conversation, but that's a direction we need to change in terms of this keep down the cost argument. And the other point that I wanted to make was I agree that your submission has been really eye-opening, because those of us who did know about polio, I mean, we might have had friends who had polio, we know other women Rhonda Galbally is a marvellous example of somebody who had polio and then's out there doing all sorts of wonderful work, as so many women are. But this long term, you see, people did think it was fixed up, and that once people had been through it and had survived, then that was the end of the implication. And this idea that it's continuing, or that it can come back, I think is really important to make. And that's something that isn't a part of a national comprehension.
There's another point that you just raised that I have been thinking about, and that is when they're talking about cutting back, they're actually talking about, as Jocelynne says, cutting back the applicants. They're not talking about cutting back the rorting, or they're talking about the rorting, but they're applying the rorting to the applicants, not to the providers of the requirement, the things that are needed.
Yes, when they were thinking of introducing the independent assessors, there was a absolutely huge community outcry. You probably saw some of it in the papers. About that very thing. Yeah.
Yeah, just one.
People got people suddenly got their NDIS dollar value cut in half with no explanation whatsoever, and that really mucks up your life.
Of course. And the final point I would just like to raise, which your discussions triggered off, is that what people don't realise either is the energy, the extra energy it takes for somebody with a disability to function in the world as do those people without one. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about this obligation to fill in forms, and Mary Kerr referred to sending back receipts and so forth. You've got the disability. It might take you hours to get out of bed in the morning, might take you a terribly long time to get dressed, much longer than people without a disability. And here on top of it is fill out all these receipts, make all these applications, put in all this paperwork. And that's another level of energy, which is an additional burden.
And getting on a tram and walking more than 100 paces. And standing in a queue for more than 5 minutes without the ability to sit down.
Good. Okay. Well, I think that we've had a very valuable contribution, Barbary Clarke. Really appreciate it. We're now going to adjourn for lunch, but I think you're going on a trip, so best wishes on the trip, and thank you very much for your submission.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah. I just wanted also, for the record, to say N.A. Heath, that's Heath, extending the concept of successful ageing to persons ageing with disabilities, unpublished PhD of the University of Melbourne dated 2018, so that we have it for the record, and when we transmit this these hearings, it'll be on the record that that's the PhD to which you were referring.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I did emphasise unpublished, implicating to the publishers out there that they should actually think about negotiating with NA Heath to actually turn it into a published PhD. Good.
Yeah, I was encouraging Nikki to do so, but she was having very severe eye problems at the time, so I don't think she ever got round to doing anything about it. But she may have.
Good. Thank you. So thanks so much, Barbary, and we'll now adjourn for lunch. Thank you.
Bye.